A black girl tells her dad, "The police did it again." He's instantly on high alert. What could have happened this time? But as he digs deeper, he uncovers something far worse than he imagined. What he does next will change everything for them both. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Selena burst through the front door, her backpack swinging wildly as she ran inside. Tears streamed down her face, leaving wet trails on her dark cheeks. Her swimming goggles, usually worn proudly around her neck, dangled limply from her hand. Lydia looked up from the kitchen counter where she'd been preparing dinner, her heart immediately clenching at the sight of her daughter in distress. "Selena, baby, what's wrong?" But Selena didn't stop. She raced past the kitchen, her footsteps thundering up the stairs. Lydia dropped the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables and quickly wiped her hands on her apron. The sound of Selena's sobs echoed through the house. "Selena!" Lydia called again, following her daughter's path up the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under her feet as she hurried to the second floor. She reached Selena's bedroom door, just as it slammed shut with a bang that seemed to shake the whole house. Lydia took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She could hear Selena crying on the other side of the door. Each sob felt like a knife in her chest. She reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. "Baby, please open the door," Lydia said softly, pressing her palm against the cool wood. "Talk to me. Whatever happened, we can figure it out together." "Go away." Selena's voice was muffled, but clearly distressed. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's wrong," Lydia insisted, her voice firm but gentle. She leaned against the doorframe, her mind racing through possibilities of what could have upset her daughter so badly. Was it something at school? The swim team? Those thoughts made her stomach twist with worry. Through the door, she could hear Selena's breathing becoming more erratic, her sobs growing louder. "The police did it again!" Selena suddenly shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. Lydia's brow furrowed in confusion. "The police? What do you mean, baby? I don't understand. Please open the door so we can talk properly." But only more crying answered her. Lydia stood there, her hands still on the doorknob, feeling helpless. The words "the police" made her blood run cold. As a black mother, those words carried extra weight, extra fear. But what had happened? Selena had just been at swim practice after school. What could the police have to do with any of that? Lydia closed her eyes, listening to her daughter's pain and feeling it deep in her own heart. She wanted nothing more than to hold Selena, to protect her from whatever had hurt her. But she also knew her daughter well enough to recognize when she needed space. "Okay, baby," Lydia said softly, her forehead resting against the door. "I'm going to let you have some time to yourself. But I want you to know that I'm here when you're ready to talk. Whatever happened, we'll face it together, all right?" She waited a moment, but there was no response except for quieter crying. "Try to get some rest," Lydia added, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll be downstairs if you need me." Reluctantly, Lydia stepped away from the door. Each step back down to the kitchen felt heavy, weighted down by worry and confusion. The mention of police involvement had set off all kinds of alarm bells in her head. But Selena's emotional state made it impossible to get any clear answers right now. Back in the kitchen, Lydia stood at the counter, staring at the half-chopped vegetables without really seeing them. Her mind was upstairs with her daughter, trying to piece together what could have happened. The sound of Selena's sobs, though fainter now, still echoed in her ears. She picked up her knife again, but couldn't bring herself to continue preparing dinner. Instead, she gripped the edge of the counter, closed her eyes, and said a silent prayer for strength, both for herself and for whatever battle her daughter was facing. A few hours passed by, and Selena finally came up to the dinner table. Her eyes were puffy and red from crying, and her usual bright smile was nowhere to be seen. The dining room was quiet, except for the soft clink of silverware against plates as the Brown family ate their dinner. Lydia watched her daughter push food around her plate, barely taking a bite. The worry that had been gnawing at her all afternoon grew stronger. George, who had just returned from work, could sense the tension in the air. His dark eyes moved between his wife and daughter, trying to understand the heavy silence. "George," Lydia said softly, setting down her fork, "Selina came home crying today. She locked herself in her room and wouldn't tell me what happened." She glanced at their daughter, who kept her eyes fixed on her plate. "All she said was something about the police." George's shoulders tensed at the mention of police. He set down his glass of water and turned to face Selina. "Baby girl, what happened? Did someone hurt you?" "It's nothing, Daddy," Selina mumbled, still not looking up. Her hand trembled slightly as she pushed a piece of broccoli across her plate. "Selina," George's voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me, sweetheart. If something happened, we need to know. We can't help if we don't know what's wrong." Selina shook her head, her braids swaying with the movement. "I don't want to talk about it." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Lydia reached across the table and placed her hand over Selina's. "Baby, you've been crying for hours. This isn't like you. Was it something at swim practice?" At the mention of swimming, Selina's lower lip started to tremble. She pulled her hand away from her mother's and gripped her fork tighter. "Can I be excused?" she asked, her voice cracking. "No, young lady," George said, his tone still gentle but leaving no room for argument. "Something's clearly upset you, and as your parents, we need to know what it is. Does this have something to do with what you said earlier about the police?" Selina's shoulders hunched forward, making her look smaller in her chair. "I said it's nothing," she insisted, but tears were starting to well up in her eyes again. "Selina Brown," Lydia said, using her full name to show she meant business. "We're your parents. We love you, and we're worried about you. Whatever happened today, you don't have to face it alone." George nodded in agreement. "Your mother's right. If someone's giving you trouble, especially if it involves the police, we need to know. We can't protect you if we don't know what we're protecting you from." Selina finally looked up, her eyes swimming with tears. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, struggling to find the words. The dining room fell silent once more, the only sound being the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall and Selina's shaky breathing. She started, then stopped again. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand. "I just want to swim. That's all I want to do. Why can't they just let me swim?" George and Lydia exchanged worried glances across the table. The pain in their daughter's voice was unmistakable, and it made their hearts ache. Whatever had happened clearly went beyond typical teenage troubles, and the mention of police involvement made it all the more concerning. "Who won't let you swim, baby?" George asked, his voice low and careful. "What happened at practice today?" The evening wound down, and George followed his usual routine of tucking Selina into bed. Her room was a testament to her passion for swimming, with medals hanging on one wall and posters of Olympic swimmers on another. The soft glow of her bedside lamp cast warm shadows across her collection of swimming trophies. George pulled the purple comforter up to Selina's chin, smoothing out the wrinkles just as he had done since she was little. Her eyes were still puffy from crying, but she seemed calmer now. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, his heart heavy with concern for his daughter. "Good night, baby girl," he whispered, straightening up and turning toward the door. "Daddy?" Selina's voice was small, almost fragile. "Wait." George stopped, his hand on the doorknob. He turned back to face her, noting how young and vulnerable she looked in her bed. "What is it, sweetheart?" Selena sat up slowly, hugging her knees to her chest. The movement caused her favorite stuffed dolphin to tumble onto the floor, but she didn't seem to notice. Her fingers played nervously with the edge of her blanket, and she took several deep breaths before speaking. "There's this police officer," she began, her voice trembling. "Officer Nile. He's been following me after school." George felt his chest tighten, but he kept his expression calm as he walked back to her bed and sat down on the edge. "Following you how, baby?" "In his police car," Selena continued, her words coming faster now. "At first, I thought maybe he was just patrolling, you know? But then," she paused, swallowing hard, "then he started stopping me, telling me I shouldn't be walking alone, that it wasn't safe." George's hands clenched into fists, but he forced them to relax. "How long has this been happening?" "A few weeks now," Selena whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek. "But today was different. Today he—" Her voice caught, and she took another deep breath. "He said I need to quit the swim team. Said I don't belong there, that I'm just causing trouble. He said if I keep going to practice, he'll make sure I regret it." George felt a cold anger settling in his stomach, but he kept his voice steady. "Did he say anything else?" Selena nodded, more tears falling now. "He said swimming isn't for people like me, that I should know my place." Her voice broke on the last word. "He follows me all the way from school to the pool, Daddy, every day. Sometimes he parks outside during practice and just watches. I'm scared." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their meaning. Selena's shoulders shook as she tried to hold back her sobs. And in that moment, she looked so much like the little girl who used to crawl into his lap after skinning her knee. But this wasn't a scraped knee that could be fixed with a Band-Aid and a kiss. This was something far more sinister, something that made George's blood run cold. George's hands trembled violently as he processed what his daughter had just told him. His mouth felt like sandpaper, and for a moment he couldn't find the right words, his mind racing with a father's worst fears. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice soft but urgent, barely masking the anger building inside him. Has he tried to hurt you, baby?" His heart pounded against his chest as he waited for her answer. Selena's grip on her blanket tightened until her knuckles turned white. "Sometimes he drives really close to the sidewalk where I'm walking, like he's trying to scare me. His police car makes this awful noise when it gets too close. Last week, he got out of his car and blocked my path. He stood there, all big and mean in his uniform, and wouldn't let me pass until I promised to think about quitting the team." George felt sick to his stomach, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His daughter had been dealing with this terror alone for weeks, walking those streets in fear. "Why didn't you tell us sooner, Selena?" He reached for her hand, his touch gentle despite his inner turmoil. "I was scared," she whispered, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, her shoulders hunched with the weight of her secret. And embarrassed. I thought maybe if I just ignored him, he'd stop. I didn't want to worry you and Mom." "Baby girl, why does he follow you? There has to be more to this." George's protective instincts were screaming at him to act, to do something. At this question, Selena's composure crumbled completely. She burst into tears, her whole body shaking with deep, heartbreaking sobs. George reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she cried, his shirt growing damp with her tears. Through her tears, she began to explain, her voice catching with each word. "It's because of his daughter, Lily. She's in my class at school, and she's on the swim team too." Selena's voice was muffled against her father's shirt, her fingers clutching at the fabric. I'm the only black girl on the team, Daddy. The only one. Everyone stares at me when I walk into practice." She pulled back slightly, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. "Officer Nile says I pollute the water. He says I make everyone disgusted and that I don't belong there." Each word seemed to cause her physical pain as she spoke them, her voice breaking with every cruel memory. George held his daughter tighter, fighting to control his own emotions as she continued, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "But that's not all," Selena said, her voice growing smaller, almost disappearing into the quiet of her bedroom. "Lily's always been second best on the team. But I'm better than her. Coach says I could even qualify for regionals next month." She looked up at her father, her eyes full of hurt and confusion, searching for answers he wished he could give. "Officer Nile says he won't let that happen. He says his daughter deserves to win. And the only way is if I quit before the competition. He says people like us shouldn't even try to compete." George pulled Selena closer, his heart aching as he gently stroked her hair. "Listen to me, baby girl. You don't have to go to school tomorrow. I'll take care of this." His voice was soft, but carried a strength that made Selena's trembling subside a little. "Really?" she asked, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her pajamas. "Yes, really. But I need to know his full name. Did you see it on his badge?" Selena nodded slowly. "Officer Matthew Nile. I remember because I always look at his badge when he's—" Her voice trailed off, and George quickly squeezed her hand, not wanting her to relive those moments. "That's enough, sweetheart. Try to get some sleep now." He tucked the blanket around her shoulders and kissed her forehead. Selena's eyes were already heavy with exhaustion from crying, and within minutes her breathing became steady and peaceful. George quietly closed her door and walked to his bedroom, his mind racing with worried thoughts. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a physical burden. Here he was, a simple man with a modest job, facing off against a police officer who seemed to hold all the cards. "What are we going to do?" Lydia's voice came from behind him. She had been waiting in their room, probably hearing every word of Selena's confession through the thin walls of their small house. "I'm going to talk to him tomorrow," George said, his voice tired but determined. Lydia moved to sit beside him, her face etched with concern. "George, maybe we should just pull her out of the swimming class. We can find her something else to do, something safer." George turned to look at his wife, seeing the fear in her eyes. He understood it. The same fear lived in his own heart. But there was something else there, too. Something that had been building since he'd heard his daughter's tears. "No," he said firmly, standing up. "No, we're not doing that, Lydia. We can't teach our daughter to run away when things get hard. We can't let her believe that she doesn't belong somewhere just because someone says so." "But George, he's a police officer. What can we possibly do against him?" Lydia's voice cracked with worry. George sat back down beside his wife, taking her hands in his. "I don't know exactly what I'm going to do yet, but I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to let some racist cop bully our baby girl out of something she loves, something she's good at. We've always taught Selena to stand up for what's right, haven't we?" Lydia nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes. "Well," George continued, his voice growing stronger, "what kind of example would we be setting if we told her to give up now? If we showed her that it's okay for people to push us around just because they have a badge or because their skin is a different color?" He squeezed Lydia's hands gently. "Our daughter is the best swimmer on that team. She earned that spot. And I'm not going to let anyone take that away from her, no matter who they are." The next morning, George pulled up to Selena's school well before the final bell. He parked his old Chevrolet across the street, positioning it where he could clearly see the school entrance without drawing attention to himself. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he waited, his mind replaying Selena's tearful confession from the night before. The afternoon sun beat down on his car, making the interior uncomfortably warm despite the open windows. George loosened his collar but kept his eyes fixed on the school entrance. Parents had already started gathering, chatting amongst themselves as they waited for their children. At precisely 3:15 p.m. the bell rang, and students began pouring out of the building. George's attention was immediately drawn to a patrol car that pulled up near the school gate. Officer Matthew Nile stepped out, his police uniform crisp and authoritative. He stood by his vehicle, scanning the crowd of children with calculated interest. A young girl with blonde hair bounded down the steps, her backpack bouncing with each step. "Daddy," she called out, running toward Officer Nile. George watched as Matthew's stern expression softened momentarily as he greeted his daughter, Lily. The officer helped her into the patrol car, his movements gentle and protective, a stark contrast to the man Selena had described. After securing Lily in the car, Matthew didn't leave immediately. Instead, he walked back toward the school gate, his posture changing as he moved. His shoulders tensed, and his head swiveled from side to side, searching the crowd of departing students. George's jaw clenched as he realized what, or rather who, the officer was looking for. Matthew positioned himself near the gate, his hands resting on his belt in a pose that might have seemed casual to others, but struck George as deliberately intimidating. The officer's eyes narrowed as he continued to scan the thinning crowd of students, clearly growing frustrated at not finding his target. The minutes ticked by, and still Matthew lingered, even as the last few stragglers made their way out of the school. His daughter waited in the patrol car, but he seemed more concerned with finding Selena than leaving with Lily. The officer's face darkened with each passing moment, his fingers drumming impatiently against his belt. Finally, when the school grounds had nearly emptied, Matthew's posture changed again. His shoulders slumped slightly in disappointment, and his face twisted into a scowl. He cast one last searching look across the schoolyard before turning back toward his patrol car, his steps heavy with frustrated purpose. George watched it all, his hands now clenched so tight on the steering wheel that his knuckles had turned white. The scene before him confirmed everything Selena had told him. This man, this officer of the law, had been lying in wait to intimidate his daughter, a child. The realization made his blood boil, but it also filled him with a deep sense of dread. How long had this been going on? How many other times had his precious daughter faced this man's hatred alone? As Officer Matthew turned to walk back to his patrol car, George felt something snap inside him. The sight of this uniformed man sworn to protect and serve, deliberately stalking children, made his protective instincts surge. Without fully realizing what he was doing, George pushed open his car door and stepped out into the warm afternoon air. "Officer Nile," George called out, his voice steady despite the anger coursing through him. He crossed the street with purposeful strides, his work boots hitting the pavement with determined steps. Matthew turned, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. His eyes narrowed as he took in George's approach. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone clipped and professional, but his eyes cold. "I'm Selena Brown's father," George said, stopping a few feet away from the officer. "And I know what you've been doing to my daughter." A small, cruel smile played at the corners of Matthew's mouth. "Mr. Brown, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just here picking up my daughter." "Don't play innocent." George's voice was low but firm. "Following her after school? Threatening her? telling her she doesn't belong in the swimming class because she's black? Matthew glanced around the nearly empty schoolyard, then took a step closer to George. "Listen here," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I've been on the force for 15 years. The police chief is my brother-in-law. The mayor comes to my house for dinner." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Do you really want to start something you can't finish?" George felt his hands trembling with rage, but he forced them to stay at his sides. "She's just a little girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And my Lily is just a little girl who deserves to win," Matthew replied, his face hardening. "Your daughter doesn't belong in that pool, and you know it. Make her quit the competition, Mr. Brown. It's better for everyone." George stared at the officer, seeing the deep-seated hatred in his eyes. The weight of his powerlessness pressed down on him like a physical force. This man had a badge, a gun, and connections. George had nothing but his love for his daughter and his sense of justice, neither of which seemed enough in this moment. "This isn't over," George managed to say, though he could hear the defeat in his own voice. "Yes, it is," Matthew replied confidently, "unless you want to make things difficult for your family. Think about it, Mr. Brown. Really think about it." George stood there for a moment longer, his fists clenched at his sides, before turning away. Each step back to his car felt like a betrayal to Selena, but what choice did he have? He could hear Matthew's soft, satisfied chuckle behind him. Once back in his car, George gripped the steering wheel hard, his knuckles white with tension. He started the engine and pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the school and the man who held so much power over his daughter's happiness. The taste of helplessness was bitter in his mouth as he drove away. George pulled into the police station parking lot, his hands still shaking from the confrontation with Officer Nile. The brick building loomed before him, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. He sat in his car for a moment, gathering his courage, reminding himself that he was doing this for Selena. Inside, the station buzzed with typical afternoon activity. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as officers moved about, shuffling papers and answering phones. George approached the front desk, where a young officer sat typing at his computer. "Can I help you, sir?" the officer asked, barely glancing up from his screen. "Yes, I'd like to file a complaint against an officer," George said, keeping his voice steady despite his nerves. The typing stopped. The officer looked up, his expression changing slightly. "All right, sir. Please fill out this form." He slid a clipboard across the counter. George took it and settled into one of the hard plastic chairs in the waiting area. His pen moved across the paper as he detailed everything Selena had told him. The following, the threats, the racist comments. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, but his words were clear and precise. When he returned to the desk, a different officer had joined the first one. They both read through his complaint, their faces growing increasingly uncomfortable. "Sir," the second officer said, clearing his throat, "you're filing this against Officer Matthew Nile?" "That's correct," George replied firmly. The two officers exchanged glances. The younger one picked up his phone and made a quick call, speaking in hushed tones. Minutes later, a sergeant emerged from a back office. He took the complaint form, scanning it quickly. "Mr. Brown, I'm Sergeant Roberts. You understand these are serious allegations?" "Yes, sir, I do." "And you say Officer Nile has been harassing your daughter? Do you have any proof of these incidents?" George's heart sank. "My daughter's testimony." "Sir," the sergeant interrupted, "Officer Nile is our senior inspector. He's been with the department for 15 years, with a spotless record. Without concrete evidence, video footage, witnesses, anything, we can't process this complaint." "But my daughter—" "It's her word against a decorated officer's," the sergeant said, his tone final. We can't take action based on unsubstantiated claims. George looked around the room, noting how other officers were deliberately avoiding eye contact. Some were pretending to be busy with paperwork. Others had suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. "So you're not even going to investigate?" George asked, his voice rising slightly. The sergeant folded the complaint form in half. "Mr. Brown, I suggest you think very carefully about pursuing this matter. False accusations against a police officer are a serious offense." The threat in his words was clear, though his tone remained professional. George stood there, feeling the weight of institutional power pressing down on him. Every person in this room worked under Matthew Nile. Every one of them knew exactly what was happening, and not one would help. "Thank you for your time," George said quietly, turning toward the exit. As he walked out, he could feel their eyes on his back, could almost hear their collective sigh of relief that he wasn't going to make trouble. In his car, George sat staring at the steering wheel. The system that was supposed to protect his daughter had just shown him exactly where he stood. He had tried to do things the right way, and the right way had failed him completely. George's car pulled into the driveway of their modest home, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. His heart felt heavy as he walked up the path to their front door, knowing the difficult conversation that lay ahead. Inside, he found Selena sitting at the kitchen table, her swimming gear spread out before her. She was running her fingers over her blue competition swimsuit, the one she'd saved up for months to buy. Her eyes were red and puffy, evidence that she'd been crying again. "Baby girl," George said softly, pulling out a chair next to her. Selena looked up, hope flickering across her face. "Did you talk to him, Dad? Did you make him stop?" George's throat tightened. He reached out and took her small hand in his. "I did talk to him, sweetheart. And then I went to the police station to file a complaint." "What did they say?" Her voice trembled with anticipation. George shook his head slowly. "They wouldn't help us, baby. Officer Nile. He has too much power there. All those officers work for him." Selena's shoulders slumped, and fresh tears welled up in her eyes. "So what do we do now?" George took a deep breath, hating every word he had to say next. "Selena, I think we need to keep you safe. And right now, that means staying away from school and the swimming pool for a while." "But Dad—" Selena pulled her hand away, her voice rising with panic. "The competition is in 3 weeks. I've been training so hard." "I know, baby, I know." George felt his own eyes stinging. "But this man, he's dangerous. He's threatened you, and he's made it clear he won't stop." Selena stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "It's not fair. Why should I have to quit? I didn't do anything wrong." "You didn't do anything wrong at all," George agreed, his voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes in life, we have to make hard choices to stay safe. It doesn't mean we're giving up forever. It just means we need to be smart right now." Selena collapsed back into her chair, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "But swimming is everything to me, Dad. You know that." George moved his chair closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I know, baby girl, and it kills me to ask you to do this. But I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you." They sat in silence for several minutes, Selena's tears gradually subsiding. Finally, she whispered, "He really scared me, Dad. The way he looked at me, like I wasn't even human." George pulled her closer, his heart breaking. "I know, sweetheart." "Okay," she said quietly, wiping her eyes. "I'll stop. For now." She picked up her swimsuit, holding it close to her chest. "But I'm not giving up forever, right?" "Never forever," George promised, kissing the top of her head. "We'll figure something out. We just need some time to make a better plan." Selena nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on her swimming gear. She began slowly folding her suit and towel, each movement careful and deliberate, as if she were packing away pieces of her dream. The next morning, George found himself wandering through Riverside Park, his mind heavy with worry about Selena. The autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched beneath his feet as he walked along the winding path. He needed time to think, to clear his head, and somehow find a way to help his daughter. Near the small pond at the center of the park, George noticed an elderly black man sitting on a bench. The man's attention was fixed on some children playing by the water's edge, a gentle smile on his weathered face. Something about his calm presence made George slow his pace. As George approached, the older man looked up and nodded in greeting. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "Sure is," George replied, pausing near the bench. The man patted the empty space beside him. "Care to join me? I'm Samuel." George hesitated for a moment before sitting down. "I'm George. You come here often?" Samuel chuckled softly. "Most mornings. Watching these kids splash around reminds me of my coaching days." "Coaching?" George's interest piqued. "Swimming," Samuel explained, his eyes twinkling. "Spent 30 years coaching, even made it to the Olympics with some of my athletes. Retired now, though sometimes I miss it." George felt his heart skip a beat. He turned to study Samuel more closely. "The Olympics? Really?" 3 different times, Samuel nodded. "But that was before my knee gave out. These days, I just enjoy watching others in the water." George was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. "My daughter loves swimming. She's really good at it, too." "Oh?" Samuel turned to face him, genuine interest in his expression. The whole story came tumbling out. About Selena's talent, her dedication, and then about Officer Niles' threats and intimidation. George's voice cracked as he described having to tell her to quit. Samuel listened intently, his expression growing serious. When George finished, the older man shook his head slowly. "Some things never change, do they? But that girl of yours, she shouldn't have to give up her dreams because of one man's hatred." "I don't know what else to do," George admitted. "I have to keep her safe." Samuel was quiet for a moment, seeming to consider something. Then he straightened up, decision clear in his eyes. "You know, I have a private pool at my house. Built it years ago for training. These days it doesn't get much use." George looked at him, hardly daring to hope. "If your daughter wants to keep swimming," Samuel continued, "I'd be happy to train her. Officer Nile would never need to know." "You'd do that?" George asked, amazement in his voice. "Of course," Samuel smiled. "I've been looking for a reason to get back into coaching. Maybe this is it. We could train early mornings or evenings, whenever works best. Keep it completely under the radar." "I don't know how we could ever repay you," George started, but Samuel waved him off. "The only payment I want is to see a talented young swimmer reach her potential. No child should have to abandon their passion because of prejudice." That evening, George sat with Lydia in their living room after Selena had gone to bed. The table lamp cast a warm glow as he explained his encounter with Samuel in the park. Lydia listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap, but her furrowed brow revealed her concern. "I don't know, George," she said softly. "Meeting a stranger in the park, having Selena train at his house, it sounds risky." George leaned forward in his chair. "I understand your worry, Lydia, but Samuel's reputation checks out. I looked him up online. He really did coach in the Olympics. There are articles about him and everything." Lydia stood up and walked to the window, hugging herself. "It's not just about his credentials. What if Officer Nile finds out? He could make things even worse." "Samuel's place is on the other side of town," George explained, "and we'd be careful. No one would need to know." Just then, They heard a small sound from the hallway. Both turned to see Selena standing there in her pajamas, tears streaming down her face. "I heard you talking," she whispered. "Please, Mom. Please let me keep swimming." Lydia's expression softened as she looked at her daughter. The past few days had taken their toll. Selena's usual bright smile was gone, replaced by dark circles under her eyes and slumped shoulders. "Come here, baby." Lydia opened her arms, and Selena ran into them. "I'm just trying to keep you safe." "I know, Mom," Selena sniffled. "But swimming is everything to me. And if this Coach Samuel can help—" George joined them, placing a gentle hand on Lydia's shoulder. "We could at least meet him first, see his setup. Make sure everything feels right." Lydia held Selena close, running her fingers through her daughter's hair. After a long moment, she sighed. "Okay, we'll meet him together, as a family. Then we'll decide." Selena pulled back, hope lighting up her face for the first time in days. "Really?" "Really," Lydia nodded, managing a small smile. "But we'll need to be extra careful. No telling anyone at school, not even your best friends." "I promise," Selena exclaimed, hugging both her parents tight. "Thank you, thank you." George smiled at his daughter's excitement. "I'll call Samuel tomorrow, set up a time for us all to meet." "And if everything checks out," Lydia added, "and if we all feel comfortable with the arrangement, then yes, you can train with him." Selena's whole demeanor had transformed. Her eyes sparkled with renewed energy, and she bounced on her toes as she spoke. "When can we meet him? Can we go tomorrow? I can't wait to get back in the water." "Slow down there, sweetie," George chuckled. "First things first. Now, it's way past your bedtime." Okay, Selena agreed, but her smile didn't fade. She hugged them both again before heading back to her room, practically skipping despite her tiredness. After she left, Lydia turned to George. "I hope we're doing the right thing." "We are," George assured her, pulling her close. "Our girl deserves a chance to chase her dreams. We just need to be smart about it." The abandoned community pool sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown grass and crumbling concrete. Despite its worn appearance, the pool itself remained clean and well-maintained. Coach Samuel had been quietly keeping it up for years, though few knew about it. In the dim light of early morning, Selena arrived with her father. George watched from the bleachers as Samuel put his daughter through her paces. The old coach stood at the pool's edge, his experienced eyes tracking every movement as Selena cut through the water. "Keep your elbows high on the recovery," Samuel called out, his voice firm but encouraging. "That's it. Now feel the water. Don't fight it." Selena adjusted her stroke, her movements becoming smoother and more efficient. The water barely rippled as she glided through it, her breathing falling into a steady rhythm. After completing her laps, she pulled herself out of the pool, breathing hard but smiling. "Good work," Samuel nodded approvingly. "Your form is improving. Now let's work on your turns." The training sessions were intense. Samuel believed in building strength both in and out of the water. He had Selena doing push-ups, planks, and specialized exercises to strengthen her core and improve her stability. Though exhausting, Selena threw herself into every workout without complaint. "Swimming isn't just about moving through water," Samuel explained as he demonstrated proper technique. "It's about understanding it, becoming one with it. The water can be your greatest ally or your biggest obstacle. The difference is in how you approach it." Each morning they arrived before sunrise and finished just as the city was waking up. George would then drive Selena home in time to get ready for school, taking different routes each time to avoid being followed. The secrecy weighed on them, but watching Selena's progress made it worthwhile. Under Samuel's guidance, Selena's natural talent flourished. Her times improved dramatically, and her technique became more refined. But more than that, her confidence grew. The fear that had clouded her eyes after Officer Niles' threats began to fade, replaced by determination. "Remember," Samuel told her during one session, helping her adjust her arm position, "swimming is about more than winning races. It's about proving to yourself what you're capable of." The old pool became their sanctuary. Here, there were no threats, no prejudice, just the pure joy of swimming and the satisfaction of improvement. Samuel's decades of experience showed in every piece of advice he offered, every correction he made. They worked on starts, turns, and finishes. Samuel taught Selena how to conserve energy during longer distances and how to explode off the blocks for sprints. He shared techniques he'd used with Olympic athletes, adapting them for Selena's style and strength. "You have something special," Samuel told her one morning as she caught her breath after a particularly challenging set. "I've coached many swimmers, but few with your natural feel for the water." The compliment made Selena beam with pride, motivating her to push even harder. She absorbed every lesson, every tip, determined to make the most of this opportunity. Though they couldn't tell anyone about their training, the progress she made spoke volumes. To maintain their cover, Selena still attended regular classes at school, but stayed away from the school's pool. If anyone asked, she simply said she wasn't feeling well. Meanwhile, her early morning sessions with Samuel continued to shape her into an even stronger swimmer. Officer Niles drummed his fingers on his patrol car's steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the empty spot where Selena usually waited for the school bus. It had been a week since he'd seen her, and her continued absence from both school and swimming practice gnawed at him. Something wasn't right. He pulled out his notebook, checking the detailed log he'd been keeping. No sign of the girl at any of her usual spots. Not at the bus stop, not at the school gates, not at swimming practice. His daughter, Lily, had mentioned that Selena hadn't been at any of the team meetings either. "Think you can just disappear, do you?" he muttered, starting his car. He drove slowly past the Brown residence, noting the quiet house with its drawn curtains. The morning sun cast long shadows across the modest home's front yard, where a single bicycle leaned against the porch. For the next few days, Niles parked his patrol car at strategic locations near the Browns' house. He watched George's old sedan come and go at regular hours, except for those early morning departures that caught his attention. Every day, before dawn, George's car would pull out of the driveway and head toward the industrial district. On this particular morning, Niles waited until George's car passed before pulling out to follow at a safe distance. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, making it challenging to tail someone without being noticed. He kept 3 car lengths back, his headlights off despite the pre-dawn darkness. George's sedan wound through the sleeping neighborhoods, eventually turning onto the road leading to the old industrial park. Niles' grip tightened on the steering wheel as he followed, but then George's car made an unexpected turn. By the time Niles reached the intersection, the sedan had vanished among the maze of warehouses and abandoned buildings. "Damn it!" Niles slammed his palm against the steering wheel. He cruised through the area for 30 minutes, but the industrial park's layout offered too many hiding spots. George's car was nowhere to be found. Back at the station later that day, Niles spread out a map of the industrial district on his desk. He marked the route George had taken and circled potential locations where they might be going. What was out there? Old warehouses, defunct factories, and... His eyes narrowed as he spotted something interesting on the map. The next morning, Niles arrived earlier, parking his car in the darkness well before George's usual departure time. He sat in his patrol car, sipping cold coffee and watching the Browns' house through his binoculars. When George's car backed out of the driveway, Niles noticed something he'd missed before. a gym bag in the back seat. This time he followed even more carefully, maintaining a greater distance. But once again, George's car slipped away in the industrial district's warren of streets and abandoned buildings. Niles' frustration grew with each passing day as the same pattern repeated itself. He began spending his free time driving through the industrial area, looking for signs of activity, checking empty buildings, and noting down anything suspicious. His obsession with finding out what the Browns were up to consumed his thoughts. He started taking longer shifts, requesting patrols near their house, and documenting every movement he observed. At the station, his desk became cluttered with maps, surveillance notes, and schedules. His fellow officers noticed his increasing preoccupation, but kept their distance, recognizing the dangerous gleam in his eyes. Niles didn't care. He was determined to uncover whatever secret the Browns were hiding in those early morning disappearances. The morning started like any other, with Selena gliding through the water under Coach Samuel's watchful eye. The abandoned pool's acoustics amplified every splash and movement, making her strokes sound like rolling thunder in the empty space. "Perfect form, Selena," Coach Samuel called out from the poolside. "Now let's work on your turns. Remember to keep your core tight during the flip." Selena took a deep breath and began another lap. The cool water embraced her as she moved with growing confidence, her movements becoming more precise with each passing day. The old pool might have been forgotten by most, but for her, it had become a sanctuary of hope and determination. Suddenly, a metallic clang echoed through the building. Coach Samuel's head snapped toward the sound, his body tensing. Selena stopped mid-stroke, treading water as she looked questioningly at her coach. "Out of the pool," Samuel whispered urgently, making a quick cutting motion with his hand. "Quickly and quietly." Selena pulled herself out of the water with practiced ease, barely making a sound. Water dripped from her swimsuit as Samuel grabbed their towels and bags, ushering her behind a stack of old maintenance equipment. Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor outside. A beam of light swept across the pool area as someone shone a flashlight through the dusty windows. Selena's heart pounded in her chest as she recognized Officer Niles' silhouette through the grimy glass. They crouched lower behind their hiding spot, hardly daring to breathe. The door handle rattled, and Selena clutched Samuel's arm. The old coach squeezed her hand reassuringly, both of them frozen in place as Officer Niles' footsteps circled the building's perimeter. The beam of light passed over their hiding spot again, and Selena squeezed her eyes shut, praying the shadows would keep them hidden. Minutes that felt like hours crawled by, until finally the footsteps began to fade. Even after the sound of a car engine rumbled to life and disappeared into the distance, they waited several more minutes before moving. When they finally emerged from their hiding place, Selena was shivering, more from fear than from the cool air on her wet skin. "He's getting closer," Samuel said quietly, handing Selena her towel. "We can't keep using this location." Selena wrapped the towel around herself, her voice trembling slightly. "What are we going to do, Coach? We can't stop training now. The competition is only weeks away." Samuel paced the pool's edge, his experienced eyes scanning their surroundings. "No, we won't stop training. We'll find somewhere else, somewhere safer." He turned to face his student, his expression determined. "I have a few ideas in mind, places where Niles won't think to look." They quickly gathered their belongings, being extra careful to leave no trace of their presence. As they prepared to leave, Selena took one last look at the pool that had become her refuge. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows, creating dancing patterns on the water's surface. "Coach," she whispered, "what if he follows us to the new location too?" Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll move again if we have to. What matters is keeping you safe, and helping you achieve your dreams. No one, especially not Officer Nile, is going to stop that. They slipped out through the back entrance, checking carefully for any sign of the police car before making their way to where George waited in his car. As they drove away, Samuel explained what had happened, and they began discussing potential new training locations. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine waters of the private indoor pool. George's old friend Marcus had agreed to let them use his home facility during the early hours, well before his family woke up. The pool, nestled in the basement of his suburban home, offered the perfect sanctuary for Selena's training. "This is amazing," Selena whispered as she took in the sight of the crystal-clear water. The pool wasn't as large as the school's, but it was well maintained and, most importantly, safe from prying eyes. Coach Samuel nodded approvingly as he inspected the facility. "The water temperature is perfect and the lighting is excellent. We can work on your technique even better here." George watched from the corner as Selena began her warm-up laps. The determination in her strokes filled him with pride. Despite everything that had happened, his daughter's spirit remained unbroken. Across town, Officer Nile sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel in frustration. He'd spent the past week checking every public pool in the area, following George's car during different times of the day, and questioning people in the neighborhood. But Selena had seemingly vanished into thin air. "Where are you hiding her?" he muttered to himself, reviewing his notes for the 100th time. The upcoming competition was just weeks away, and his daughter Lily was practicing harder than ever. But Nile couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Selena was still training somewhere. Back at Marcus's house, Selena's improvement was remarkable. The private setting allowed her to focus completely on her training without fear of harassment. Coach Samuel had her practicing new techniques, refining her turns, and working on her endurance. "Your freestyle form is getting stronger," Samuel called out as Selena completed another lap. "Let's work on your butterfly stroke now. Remember to keep your core engaged." George watched in amazement as his daughter transformed in the water. Her movements were becoming more fluid, more confident. The scared girl who had come home crying seemed like a distant memory. Meanwhile, Officer Nile's frustration was beginning to show at work. His colleagues noticed his increasing agitation and short temper. He spent his free time driving around the neighborhood, hoping to catch a glimpse of Selena or her father heading to wherever they were hiding. "She has to be practicing somewhere," he growled, pulling into the parking lot of yet another recreational center. "No one just disappears like that." But Selena hadn't disappeared. She was thriving. Under Samuel's guidance, her times were improving daily. The private pool allowed them to practice longer, and the secure location meant they could focus entirely on training without watching over their shoulders. "You're ready," Samuel announced one morning, checking his stopwatch. "Your times are better than they've ever been. If you maintain this pace, you'll be hard to beat at the competition." Selena beamed at her coach's words, while George felt tears of joy welling up in his eyes. They had turned a situation of fear and intimidation into one of triumph and growth. Despite Officer Nile's attempts to break their spirits, they had found a way to persevere. The community's response began subtly at first. Mrs. Jenkins, who lived 2 doors down from the Browns, started taking notes of when Officer Nile's patrol car cruised past their street. She shared these details with George during their morning chats over the fence, helping the family plan safer routes for Selena's training sessions. Word traveled through whispered conversations at church gatherings and neighborhood barbecues. The story of a young black girl being harassed by a police officer for excelling at swimming touched many hearts, though few dared to speak about it openly, fearing Officer Nile's influence. Marcus's wife Sarah began coordinating with other neighbors, creating an informal network of lookouts. When Officer Niles' patrol car was spotted in the area, text messages would quietly circulate among trusted community members. "Bluebird in the garden," they'd write, using their simple code to warn each other. Even the local grocery store owner, Mr. Thompson, joined the effort. His shop sat on the corner of the main street, giving him a clear view of passing patrol cars. He'd casually delay Officer Nile with friendly conversation whenever he saw George's car heading toward Marcus's house for Selena's training. "It takes a village," Samuel remarked one morning, watching as Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street pretended to water her plants while actually keeping watch. "And this village has decided to stand with Selena." The support extended beyond just keeping watch. Different families offered their homes as decoy locations, letting George's car park in their driveways at various times to confuse Officer Niles' surveillance. Some neighbors even coordinated their morning routines to create natural-looking traffic that would make it harder for him to track specific vehicles. Pastor Johnson from the local church spoke carefully during his sermons about standing together against injustice, never mentioning names, but making sure his congregation understood the importance of supporting one another. After services, church members would discreetly pass along any information they had about Officer Niles' movements or activities. The local coffee shop became an unofficial headquarters for sharing information. The baristas, all high school students who knew about Selena's situation, developed a system of signals using coffee cups to warn when Officer Nile came in for his regular morning coffee. "It's amazing," Lydia whispered to George one evening, watching from their window as neighbors casually patrolled the street during their evening walks. "They're all looking out for our baby girl." The community's protective circle grew stronger each day. Teachers from Selena's school, though unable to directly intervene, found ways to support her through remote learning arrangements. The school librarian, Mrs. Chen, specially curated swimming technique books and had them delivered to the Browns' house. What touched the family most was how naturally it all happened. There were no grand gestures or public declarations, just quiet, determined support from people who believed in doing what was right. The neighborhood had transformed into a protective shield around Selena, allowing her to continue pursuing her dreams despite Officer Niles' attempts to stop her. Officer Niles' frustration grew with each passing day. His inability to locate Selena Brown had become an obsession that darkened his thoughts and twisted his sense of duty. He began targeting other black families in the neighborhood, using minor traffic violations and suspicious person reports as excuses to stop and question them. The Thompson family was his first target. Their teenage daughter wore her hair in braids like Selena's, and he pulled their car over 3 times in 1 week. Each time, he would take his time checking their documents, asking probing questions about whether they knew the Browns or had seen Selena lately. "I'm just doing my job," he would say with a cold smile, shining his flashlight directly into their eyes. "Making sure everyone follows the rules." The Jackson kids couldn't even ride their bikes around the block without Officer Niles slowing his patrol car to a crawl beside them, following them until they rushed home in fear. Their mother filed a complaint with the police department, but without video evidence or witnesses willing to come forward, it was dismissed as unsubstantiated. At the community pool across town, he began conducting routine checks whenever he spotted black families swimming. He would demand to see their membership cards and proof of residence, something he never asked of white families. The pool manager, though uncomfortable with his behavior, felt powerless to intervene against a senior police officer. Mrs. Washington, who taught piano lessons from her home, found herself being visited regularly by Officer Nile. He claimed there were noise complaints, though her neighbors had never had issues with her teaching before. During each visit, he would try to peer inside her house, asking casual but pointed questions about the Browns. The complaints started piling up at the police station. Desk sergeants filed report after report, but Officer Niles' position as senior inspector seemed to make him untouchable. His fellow officers whispered among themselves about his behavior, but fear of retaliation kept them silent in official channels. "We understand your concerns," the police chief would say to each family that came forward, "but without concrete evidence of misconduct, our hands are tied." The harassment spread to local businesses owned by black families. Officer Nile began conducting frequent health and safety inspections at Mrs. Robinson's soul food restaurant. He would arrive during peak hours, disrupting service and intimidating customers with his presence. At the community center, he started demanding to see the membership cards of black youth who came to use the facilities. The center's director, though outraged, could only document the incidents and add them to the growing pile of complaints at the station. Even at church, black families noticed his patrol car parked across the street every Sunday, his watchful eyes noting who came and went. Pastor Johnson tried to address the situation with Niles' superiors, but his concerns were met with the same response. Without evidence, they could take no action. The community's fear was palpable, but so was their determination. Each family that faced Officer Niles' harassment added their voice to the chorus of complaints, hoping that the sheer volume would eventually force action. They documented every interaction, kept detailed records of dates and times, and supported each other through the increasingly tense situation. Still, Officer Niles' superiors remained passive. They filed the complaints away, made vague promises about looking into the situation, and continued to protect one of their own. The lack of response only emboldened him further, convinced that his position made him invulnerable to consequences. George sat at his kitchen table late one night, spreading out the growing collection of harassment complaints from other families across the surface. The dim light from above cast shadows over the papers, each one telling a similar story of Officer Niles' intimidation. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged them in chronological order, but his resolve was stronger than ever. "We need more than just written statements," he muttered to himself. "We need solid proof." The next morning, George visited several electronic stores, carefully selecting small, high-quality security cameras that could be hidden discreetly. He chose models with night vision capabilities and motion sensors, spending a significant portion of his savings on the equipment. With methodical precision, George installed the first set of cameras around their home. He placed them strategically, one overlooking the driveway, where Officer Nile often parked his patrol car, another with a clear view of their front door, where he had attempted several intimidating visits. 2 more cameras covered the side yards, ensuring no angle was left unmonitored. At the private pool where Selena trained, George worked with the owner to install additional cameras. They carefully positioned them to capture the parking lot and all entrance points. The owner, understanding the gravity of the situation, even contributed some equipment from his own security budget. These cameras record to both local storage and cloud backup, George explained to Lydia as he showed her how to access the footage on their home computer. Even if something happens to the cameras themselves, we'll have the evidence saved online. He created a detailed logbook, noting down every suspicious drive-by, every lingering patrol car, and every instance of Niles' presence near their property. Each entry included the date, time, and corresponding camera footage number. The community joined in the documentation effort. Mrs. Thompson from down the street began recording her interactions with Officer Nile on her phone. The Jackson family installed their own security cameras, capturing footage of Nile following their children. Even Pastor Johnson started keeping a journal of Nile's Sunday surveillance outside the church. George organized all the evidence methodically. He created digital folders for each type of harassment: traffic stops, home visits, surveillance, and community intimidation. Each incident was carefully labeled with dates, times, and witness information. "We're not just protecting Selena anymore," George explained to Lydia as they reviewed the growing evidence. "We're standing up for everyone he's terrorized." He also set up a secure online drive where other families could upload their own documentation, videos, photos, and written accounts of their encounters with Officer Nile. The evidence began mounting, painting a clear picture of systematic harassment targeting their community. The security measures weren't just about gathering evidence. They provided peace of mind. Knowing they had cameras watching helped Selena sleep better at night. The footage gave them advance warning when Nile's patrol car entered their neighborhood, allowing them to adjust Selena's training schedule accordingly. Each morning, George would review the previous day's footage before heading to work. He meticulously tagged any appearances by Officer Nile, noting patterns in his surveillance routine. The documentation was thorough, professional, and increasingly damning. "Remember," George told Selena as they watched one of the security feeds together, "this isn't just about swimming anymore. This is about standing up for what's right, about showing that we won't be intimidated into giving up our dreams." The cameras captured it all: the lingering patrols, the suspicious vehicles, the attempts to intimidate. Each day added more evidence to their case, building a foundation of proof that would be impossible to ignore. George knew they needed to act before Officer Nile's harassment escalated further. After reviewing weeks of surveillance footage showing Nile's increasingly aggressive behavior, he gathered his family in their living room one evening. "I think I know how we can catch him," George said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "But it'll take some careful planning." He laid out a simple but clever strategy. They would spread word through carefully chosen neighbors about Selena returning to train at the old community pool. The information would be shared in whispered conversations at the grocery store, at church, and during neighborhood gatherings, places where it would eventually reach Nile's ears. George selected Mrs. Thompson as the primary source for the rumor. She worked at the local pharmacy, where Nile's wife frequently shopped. "Just mention it casually," he instructed her. "Make it sound like you're concerned about Selena going back there." The plan began to unfold. Mrs. Thompson had her choreographed conversation within earshot of Mrs. Nile, expressing worry about Selena training alone at the old community pool early in the mornings. The information spread through the community like wildfire, exactly as George had anticipated. To make the story more convincing, George drove by the old pool several times during the day, making sure he was noticed. He even carried Selena's swim bag, clearly visible in his car's back seat. He enlisted help from trusted neighbors to park their cars near the pool at specific times, creating the illusion of activity. The security cameras they had installed around the old pool facility began picking up increased drive-bys from Nile's patrol car. First once a day, then twice, and finally every few hours. George watched the footage with grim satisfaction, noting how Nile would slow down, studying the building and its surroundings. "He's taking the bait," George told Lydia as they reviewed the footage together. "Look how he circles the building, trying to figure out the best way in." They reinforced their surveillance at the old pool, adding more hidden cameras with better angles. George made sure each entrance and possible hiding spot was covered. He wanted no chance of missing whatever Nile might attempt. The community rallied behind their plan. Pastor Johnson volunteered to keep watch from his study across the street. The local coffee shop owner, whose shop opened early, agreed to alert them if she spotted anything suspicious during the morning hours. Meanwhile, Selena continued her real training at the private pool, safely away from Nile's prying eyes. She practiced harder than ever, driven by the knowledge that they were finally taking action against her tormentor. Just as George had predicted, Nile's surveillance of the old pool became more frequent and obvious. The security footage showed him parking his patrol car in different locations around the facility, watching intently. He began appearing during his off-duty hours as well in his personal vehicle, making less effort to conceal his presence. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for Niall to make his move. George kept the cameras rolling 24/7, monitoring every feed, knowing that when Niall finally acted, they would have everything recorded from multiple angles. "Remember," George told his family, "we only get one chance at this. We need to let him think he's got the upper hand." He checked the camera feeds one more time, ensuring everything was in working order. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back now. In the pre-dawn darkness, Officer Matthew Niall crept toward the old community pool. The security lights cast long shadows across the empty parking lot as he approached the chain-link fence. He carried a dark duffel bag, his movements purposeful and quick. Using his police-issued keys, he unlocked the maintenance gate. The hinges creaked softly as he slipped inside. Niall moved with practiced efficiency, checking his surroundings before proceeding to the pool deck. Hidden in a nearby maintenance shed, George watched the security feed on his tablet. Pastor Johnson and 3 other community members waited silently beside him. The infrared cameras provided a clear view of Niall's actions as he knelt by the pool's edge. Niall unzipped his duffel bag and began removing objects: broken glass, rusty nails, and jagged metal pieces. He carefully arranged them along the pool deck, concentrating on the areas where swimmers would typically enter and exit the water. "He's actually doing it," whispered Mr. Martinez, one of the volunteers. "That could seriously hurt someone." George's jaw tightened as he watched Niall methodically place the dangerous items. He pressed the emergency signal button on his phone, alerting the state police officers waiting nearby. They had agreed to intervene only when presented with clear evidence of criminal activity. Niall continued his work, unaware of the multiple cameras recording his every move. He placed the last few sharp objects near the starting blocks, where swimmers would plant their feet to dive. George nodded to the group. They emerged from their hiding spot, flashlights blazing. "That's enough, Officer Niall," George's voice rang out across the pool deck. Niall froze, then quickly reached for his service weapon. Before he could draw it, the state police officers burst through the gate, weapons drawn. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" The commanding officer's voice echoed off the pool walls. Niall raised his hands slowly, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. The state officers quickly moved in, securing his weapon and placing him in handcuffs. "We have everything on camera," George said, holding up his tablet. "Every second of you placing those objects trying to hurt my daughter." The state police documented the scene, photographing the sharp objects and collecting them as evidence. They retrieved the security footage from multiple cameras, ensuring a complete record of Niall's actions from every angle. The cameras caught him entering with a duffel bag, one officer noted, reviewing the footage. "And we have clear shots of him placing the objects. This is more than enough for an arrest." As they led Niall to the patrol car, he glared at George. "You set me up," he spat. "No," George replied calmly. "You did this to yourself. We just made sure everyone could see who you really are." The state police took statements from George and the community members present. Their testimonies, combined with the video evidence, created an ironclad case against Officer Niall. Dawn was breaking as the last police car pulled away. George looked at the pool, now cleared of Niall's dangerous trap. The water reflected the early morning light, peaceful once again. Pastor Johnson placed a supportive hand on George's shoulder as they watched the sun rise over the pool, where Selena would soon be free to swim without fear. The morning sun streamed through the Browns' kitchen window as George shared the news with his family. Selena sat between her parents at the breakfast table, her eyes wide as her father recounted the events at the pool. "They took him away in handcuffs," George explained, his voice steady but filled with relief. "The state police have all the evidence, multiple camera angles showing exactly what he was doing." Lydia reached across the table and squeezed her husband's hand. Her shoulders, which had been tense for weeks, finally relaxed. "I can't believe it's really over," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Selina looked from her mother to her father. "So Officer Nile can't hurt me anymore?" Her voice was small but hopeful. "No, baby," George assured her, pulling her close. "He's going to face consequences for what he did. The state police said the evidence is very clear. They found the sharp objects he planted, they have the security footage, and statements from everyone who witnessed it." "The police chief called this morning," Lydia added, pouring more orange juice into Selina's glass. "He wanted to personally apologize to our family. They're conducting a full investigation into Officer Nile's behavior over the past few years." Selina took a deep breath, and for the first time in weeks her smile reached her eyes. "Does this mean I can go back to swimming at school?" "Yes, sweetheart," Lydia nodded, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You can go back to your regular classes. Officer Nile won't be able to bother you anymore." George pulled out his phone to show them a news article that had just been published. The headline read, "Local police officer arrested for attempted assault and harassment." The story detailed the investigation and included statements from the state police about their commitment to addressing abuse of power. "Other families are coming forward now," George explained. "They're sharing their own stories about Officer Nile's harassment. The police department can't ignore it anymore." And Lydia stood up and wrapped her arms around both George and Selina. "I'm so proud of how brave you both were," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Standing up to him wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do." "Coach Samuel called earlier," George added. "He says you can keep training with him if you want to, Selina. He's really proud of how you've handled everything." Selina nodded enthusiastically. "I want to keep training with him. He's taught me so much." The family sat together at the kitchen table, allowing themselves to feel the full weight of their relief. The constant fear that had haunted their home for weeks finally began to lift. Outside, birds chirped in the morning sun, and the sound of children playing filtered through the window, ordinary sounds that now felt extraordinarily precious. "Thank you, Daddy," Selina said quietly, leaning against her father's shoulder, "for believing me and protecting me." George hugged his daughter tightly, meeting Lydia's eyes over Selina's head. They shared a look of profound gratitude for their family's safety, for justice being served, and for the strength they'd found together. The following Monday, Selina walked through the school gates with her head held high. Her father's car idled at the curb until she disappeared inside the building, a habit they weren't quite ready to break. The familiar halls felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a heavy cloud had finally lifted. Students and teachers alike welcomed her back warmly. Many had heard about Officer Nile's arrest on the local news, and whispers followed her through the corridors. But these weren't the harsh whispers she'd grown used to. They were filled with admiration and support. During lunch break, the swimming coach, Mrs. Martinez, approached Selina's table. "We've missed you in the pool," she said, placing a gentle hand on Selina's shoulder. "The competition is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. Will you be joining us?" Selina's heart fluttered with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "Yes, I'll be there," she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. That afternoon, she stood at the edge of the school pool, breathing in the familiar chlorine scent. Her teammates gathered around, offering encouraging smiles. Even Lily, Officer Nile's daughter, kept her distance and remained quiet, a welcome change from her previous taunts. As Selena slipped into the water for warm-up laps, the cool embrace of the pool reminded her of all the secret training sessions with Coach Samuel. His techniques had improved her form significantly, and she could feel the difference in every stroke. After practice, Mrs. Martinez pulled her aside. "Your technique has improved remarkably," she observed. "Whatever training you did during your absence clearly paid off." Back home that evening, Selena sat at her desk, marking the competition date on her calendar with a bright red circle. The nervous energy that had been building all day finally spilled over, and she found herself pacing her room. "You okay, sweetheart?" Lydia asked from the doorway, noticing her daughter's restlessness. "I'm nervous about the competition," Selena admitted. "Everyone will be watching. What if I mess up?" Lydia crossed the room and sat on Selena's bed, patting the space beside her. "Come here," she said. When Selena sat down, Lydia wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You've worked so hard for this. Coach Samuel believes in you, Mrs. Martinez believes in you, and most importantly, you've shown incredible strength these past few weeks." Selena leaned against her mother. "It feels strange being back in the school pool. Good strange, but still strange." "That's natural," Lydia assured her. "But remember, you're not just swimming for yourself anymore. You're showing everyone that nothing can stop you from doing what you love." The next morning, Selena arrived early at the pool for additional practice. As she performed her laps, she thought about how far she'd come. The water no longer felt like a battleground, but had returned to being her sanctuary. Each stroke brought with it a mixture of anticipation and nervousness about the upcoming competition. But underneath it all was a steady current of determination. During her practice sessions that week, she noticed other students watching her from the poolside with newfound respect. Some even asked for tips on improving their technique. The same pool where she had once felt unwelcome had transformed into a place where she could truly shine. Each day brought the competition closer, and while the butterflies in her stomach grew more active, so did her resolve. She maintained her training schedule with Coach Samuel in the mornings and attended regular practice sessions at school in the afternoons. The dual training kept her focused and helped channel her nervous energy into preparation. One afternoon, as Selena was gathering her things after swimming practice, she noticed Lily hovering nearby, fidgeting with the strap of her swim bag. The pool area had emptied except for the two of them, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the tiles. "Can we talk?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Selena tensed but nodded, remembering how quiet Lily had been since her return. They sat on the nearest bench, leaving a careful space between them. "I'm so sorry," Lily began, her words tumbling out in a rush. "What my father did was horrible. I knew it was wrong, but I was too scared to say anything." Her eyes welled with tears. "The truth is, I've always thought you were amazing in the water. The way you move, it's like you were born to swim." Selena watched as Lily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The girl before her seemed so different from the one who used to smirk when her father harassed Selena. "Sometimes during practice, I would try to copy your technique," Lily continued. "You make it look so effortless. I was jealous, but I also admired you. I still do." Other swimmers began filtering in for the afternoon session, and a few stopped to watch the unexpected conversation. Among them were Sarah and Madison, two girls who had always kept their distance from Selena. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, approaching cautiously. Lily straightened up. "Yes, I was just telling Selena how sorry I am about everything that happened." Madison joined them, pulling up a chair. "We all are," she said. "We should have spoken up when we saw what was happening." "It wasn't right," Sarah added. "And you're incredible, Selena. The way you kept coming back, even with everything going on, that takes real courage." More teammates gathered around, each offering their own words of support and admiration. Some shared stories of times they'd been inspired by Selena's dedication, while others expressed regret for not standing up sooner. "Would you maybe want to practice together sometimes?" Lily asked hesitantly. "I could really learn a lot from you." Selena felt a warmth spread through her chest, different from the ache she'd carried for so long. "I'd like that," she replied with a small smile. The group spent the next hour talking and laughing, sharing swimming tips and stories. What had started as a tense conversation had transformed into something unexpected, the beginning of real friendships. As they all prepared to leave, Lily touched Selena's arm gently. "I want you to know," she said, "that in the competition, I hope the best swimmer wins, fair and square. And between you and me," she added with a genuine smile, "my money's on you." The other girls nodded in agreement, and for the first time, Selena felt truly accepted by her teammates. She wasn't just the only black girl in the swimming class anymore. She was Selena Brown, respected athlete and friend. The morning of the competition dawned bright and clear. Selena stood at the edge of the pool, her heart pounding beneath her competition swimsuit. The familiar scent of chlorine filled her nostrils as she adjusted her swim cap, tucking in every strand of hair with practiced precision. In the stands, George and Lydia sat with Coach Samuel, their faces beaming with pride. Around them, the bleachers were packed with spectators, including many familiar faces from their community, who had supported them through the difficult times. "Lane 4, Selena Brown," the announcer's voice echoed through the natatorium. Selena stepped onto the starting block, her muscles coiled with anticipation. She could see Lily in lane 5, who gave her a quick, encouraging nod. The pool stretched before her like a sheet of glass, each lane marked with crisp lines that disappeared into the deep blue. As she took her mark, time seemed to slow down. The crowd's murmur faded into the background, leaving only the sound of her own steady breathing. The starting horn blared. Selena's dive was perfect, just as Coach Samuel had taught her. She entered the water with minimal splash, her body cutting through the surface like an arrow. The cool water embraced her as she began her powerful butterfly strokes, her movements fluid and precise. From the stands, Coach Samuel watched intently as his protege executed each turn with flawless technique. The countless hours of early morning training were evident in every movement. George clutched Lydia's hand, both of them leaning forward in their seats as Selena maintained her lead. At the halfway point, Selena was a full body length ahead of the competition. Her arms carved through the water with remarkable efficiency, her kicks creating a controlled turbulence that propelled her forward. The audience was on their feet now, their cheers echoing off the walls. In the final lap, Selena felt the familiar burn in her muscles, but Coach Samuel's words rang in her head. "Pain is temporary, victory is forever." She pushed harder, her strokes becoming even more powerful. The water seemed to part before her as she surged toward the finish. The crowd's roar grew deafening as Selena touched the wall. She emerged from the water, pulling off her goggles to see the scoreboard. Her time flashed in bright digits, a new pool record. The spectators erupted in thunderous applause as Selena's name appeared at the top of the rankings. Lily, who had finished second, reached across the lane divider to congratulate her. Other swimmers joined in, offering high fives and genuine smiles of admiration. The same pool, where she had once felt unwelcome, now resonated with celebration of her achievement. From his position in the stands, Coach Samuel nodded with satisfaction, watching as his student received the recognition she deserved. George and Lydia hugged each other, tears of joy streaming down their faces. The community members who had helped protect Selena during her secret training sessions cheered loudest of all. As she stood on the pool deck, water dripping from her shoulders, Selena felt a profound sense of vindication. Every early morning practice, every sacrifice, every moment of fear and doubt had led to this triumph. She had proven that talent and determination could overcome prejudice and intimidation. The awards ceremony was a moment of pure joy. Selena stood atop the podium, 3 gold medals hanging around her neck, glinting under the natatorium's bright lights. She had dominated every event she entered: butterfly, freestyle, and individual medley. Her times weren't just good, they were exceptional. Local news cameras flashed as she received her final medal. The reporter from Channel 5 waited patiently by the pool's edge, microphone in hand. When Selena finally stepped down from the podium, the reporter approached her with a warm smile. "Selena Brown, you've just won 3 gold medals and set 2 pool records. How does it feel?" the reporter asked, holding out the microphone. Selena's voice trembled slightly with emotion. "It feels amazing. I couldn't have done it without my family, Coach Samuel, and everyone who supported me." The story spread quickly through local media channels. "Local girl triumphs over adversity," read the headline in the morning paper. The article detailed not just her swimming victories, but the whole story: the harassment, the secret training, and the community's role in helping her succeed. At school the following Monday, students and teachers alike stopped to congratulate her. Even those who had previously kept their distance now approached with admiration. The principal made a special announcement over the intercom, celebrating her achievements and commending her bravery. The local YMCA invited her to speak to their youth swimming program. Selena stood before a group of young swimmers, many of them minorities, and shared her story. The children's eyes widened as she described her early morning training sessions and the determination it took to keep going. "Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong," she told them, her medals catching the light. "The water doesn't care what color your skin is. It only cares about how hard you work." Community leaders organized a celebration in her honor at the local community center. The mayor presented her with a certificate of recognition, praising her as an example of perseverance and courage. Coach Samuel beamed with pride as he watched his student receive the accolades she deserved. Local businesses put up congratulatory signs in their windows. "Way to go, Selena," and "Our local champion" appeared throughout the neighborhood. The swimming supply store downtown displayed her photo in their front window alongside her winning times. Letters and emails poured in from people who had heard her story. Many were from young athletes facing similar challenges, thanking her for showing them that it was possible to overcome discrimination and succeed. Each message reinforced what her victory meant not just for her, but for others who would follow in her wake. The State Swimming Association launched an investigation into discriminatory practices at local pools, using Selena's case as a catalyst for change. New policies were implemented to ensure equal access and treatment for all swimmers, regardless of their background. At home, George and Lydia created a special place in their living room to display Selena's medals and the newspaper clippings chronicling her journey. The wall became a testament not just to athletic achievement, but to the power of family, community, and unwavering determination in the face of injustice. The media attention surrounding Selena's story grew exponentially in the weeks following her victory. Major networks picked up the story, and reporters lined up to interview the young swimmer who had overcome such adversity. Each time she shared her story, Selena spoke with increasing confidence and clarity. "Swimming isn't just a sport for me," she told a reporter from the National Sports Network. "It's where I feel most free. In the water, nothing else matters except how hard you push yourself." The camera captured her sitting poolside. her feet dangling in the water as she continued. When Officer Nile tried to force me out, it wasn't just about swimming anymore. It was about standing up for what's right. Local newspapers ran in-depth features about her journey. They interviewed Coach Samuel, who spoke about Selena's dedication during their secret training sessions. That girl would show up at 5 a.m., never complained once, he said, his voice full of pride. She had something special, not just talent, but heart. George and Lydia appeared alongside their daughter in several interviews, sharing their perspective as parents who had to balance protecting their child with supporting her dreams. We were scared, Lydia admitted during one emotional segment, but watching Selena face this challenge taught us something about courage. Social media buzzed with Selena's story. Videos of her interviews went viral, particularly one where she addressed young athletes facing discrimination. "Don't let anyone tell you where you belong," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Your dreams are yours to chase." Civil rights organizations reached out to feature her story in their newsletters and campaigns. The NSOICP highlighted her case as an example of both ongoing discrimination and the power of community resistance. They praised not just Selena's resilience, but the way her neighborhood had united to protect one of their own. A national magazine ran a comprehensive article titled "Making Waves: The Selena Brown Story." The piece detailed everything from her early love of swimming to the community's role in gathering evidence against Officer Nile. It included powerful photographs, Selena training with Coach Samuel, the supportive signs in local shop windows, and her triumphant moment on the winner's podium. Parents wrote to local papers sharing how Selena's story had impacted their children. One mother described how her daughter, previously too intimidated to join sports, had signed up for swimming lessons after hearing Selena speak. Another family shared how they'd used Selena's story to discuss racism with their children. During a televised interview on a morning show, Selena addressed the broader implications of her experience. "This wasn't just about me," she explained. "It was about every kid who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere because of how they look. We all deserve a chance to pursue our passions." The interviews consistently highlighted the contrast between Officer Nile's attempts. The Brown family's living room buzzed with excitement as Selena sat surrounded by stacks of envelopes and colorful brochures. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened yet another letter bearing a prestigious university logo. George and Lydia watched from the couch, their faces beaming with pride. "Stanford Swimming!" Lydia gasped, peering over her daughter's shoulder. "That's incredible, baby!" Selena's story had spread far beyond their small community. Local news coverage of her victory and triumph over discrimination had caught the attention of college recruiters nationwide. The coffee table was now covered with offers from top universities, each one eager to have her join their swimming programs. "Look at this one," George said, carefully unfolding a letter. "Full athletic scholarship from the University of Michigan. They want you to train with their Olympic development program." Selena's eyes widened as she took in the details. The opportunities before her seemed almost overwhelming. Coach Samuel, who had become like family during their secret training sessions, sat in an armchair nearby, offering guidance as they reviewed each offer. The California programs would give you access to some of the best facilities in the country, Samuel noted, adjusting his reading glasses. "But don't overlook the East Coast schools. Their winter training programs in Florida are exceptional." As if the college offers weren't enough, Selena's phone kept lighting up with notifications. Elite swimming camps were reaching out, inviting her to train alongside national champions and Olympic hopefuls. "The National Youth Swimming Camp wants you for their summer intensive," Lydia announced, reading from her phone. "They've never invited someone so young before." Selena picked up a glossy brochure from Duke University, running her fingers over the photos of their state-of-the-art aquatic center. "I never thought this would happen," she said softly. "A few months ago, I was hiding in an abandoned pool. And now... George moved to sit beside his daughter, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. You earned every bit of this, sweetheart. Your talent, your determination. That's what these schools see in you. Coach Samuel nodded in agreement. These aren't just sympathy offers, Selena. Your times at the competition were exceptional. These programs recognize your potential to compete at the highest level. The doorbell rang, and Lydia returned moments later with another special delivery, a thick envelope from USA Swimming's development program. Inside was an invitation to join their Elite Athlete Pathway, a program designed to prepare promising swimmers for international competition. This is the big leagues, Samuel explained, examining the materials. This program has produced Olympic medalists. They want to start working with you right away. Selena sat back, taking it all in. The girl who had once been told she didn't belong in the water was now being courted by the most prestigious swimming programs in the country. Her phone buzzed again. Another camp invitation, this time from an Australian training center known for developing world champions. I think we're going to need a bigger coffee table, George joked, watching as yet another stack of offers threatened to topple over. Lydia wiped away happy tears as she sorted through the materials. Look at all these opportunities, baby. You can go anywhere, be anything. Selena picked up a photo from the Stanford brochure, showing their team celebrating after a championship victory. The diversity of the swimmers in the image made her smile. It was exactly the kind of environment she had dreamed of. Each one of these programs would be lucky to have you, Samuel said, his voice filled with pride. You've opened doors not just for yourself, but for other young swimmers who might have felt excluded from the sport. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the gold medals from her recent victory that hung on the wall. They served as a reminder of how far she had come, from training in secret to having the swimming world at her feet. The courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict in Officer Matthew Niles' case. George and Lydia sat in the front row, holding Selena's hands tightly. The evidence against Nile had been overwhelming. Video footage, witness testimonies, and documented patterns of harassment had painted a clear picture of his crimes. In the matter of the state versus Matthew Nile, the judge began, her voice steady and clear. This court finds the defendant guilty on all counts of harassment, endangerment of a minor, abuse of power, and attempted assault. A collective exhale rippled through the courtroom. Niles' face remained stone cold, but his shoulders slumped noticeably. His daughter, Lily, sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom, lowered her head into her hands. Officer Nile, the judge continued, your actions represent a severe breach of public trust. As a law enforcement officer, you took an oath to protect and serve all members of our community. Instead, you used your badge as a shield for racist behavior and personal vendettas against a child. The judge adjusted her glasses, reviewing the sentencing documents. This court sentences you to 5 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 3 years. Additionally, you are permanently stripped of your law enforcement credentials and barred from holding any position of public authority. Local reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. The case had attracted significant media attention, sparking widespread discussions about racial bias in law enforcement. Several police reform advocacy groups had attended every day of the trial. Outside the courthouse, community leaders gathered to address the press. Reverend Jackson, a prominent civil rights activist, spoke passionately about the verdict's significance. Today's decision sends a clear message that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or connections. But this is just one step toward addressing systemic racism in our institutions. The police chief also made a public statement announcing comprehensive reforms within the department. We're implementing mandatory bias training, establishing a civilian oversight committee, and revising our hiring and promotion processes. Officer Niles' actions do not reflect our values, and we're committed to rebuilding trust with our community." George was asked to speak as well. He stepped up to the microphones, his voice steady despite his emotion. "This verdict isn't just about justice for my daughter. It's about every child who has ever felt afraid of those sworn to protect them. It's about holding power accountable and standing up against hatred." Several of Niles' former colleagues came forward during the trial, revealing a history of similar incidents that had been swept under the rug. Their testimonies led to internal investigations in multiple precincts, exposing a culture of silence that had enabled such behavior. Civil rights organizations used the case as a catalyst for change, pushing for legislation to address racial profiling and police accountability. The state legislature began drafting new laws requiring body cameras, independent investigations of misconduct allegations, and stronger penalties for officers who abuse their authority. As the Browns left the courthouse, they were approached by other families who shared similar experiences. The case had given them courage to speak out about their own encounters with discriminatory policing. Support groups formed, creating networks for those affected by racial profiling and police harassment. Lily Nile approached the Browns before they reached their car. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was clear. "I'm testifying next week at the police reform hearing," she said. "What my father did, it wasn't right. Someone needs to speak up about what happens behind the badge." The verdict made headlines across the country, becoming a reference point in the ongoing national conversation about race and policing. Law enforcement academies began using the case in their training programs as an example of how bias and abuse of power can corrupt the principles of justice. Coach Samuel stood at the podium of the local community center, his weathered hands gripping the edges as he faced the crowd gathered to honor his contribution to Selena's success. Oh, the room was filled with families, athletes, and community leaders, all there to celebrate, not just a victory in sports, but a triumph over injustice. "When I met George in that park," Samuel began, his voice carrying decades of experience, "I saw a father fighting for his daughter's dreams. What I didn't realize was that I'd find my own purpose again." The audience listened intently as Samuel described his journey with Selena, from those first secretive training sessions to her eventual triumph. In the front row, George and Selena beamed with pride, their bond with the coach evident in their warm smiles. "Today," Samuel continued, straightening his shoulders, "I'm announcing the launch of the Equal Splash Initiative. With George's help, we'll be providing free swimming training to young athletes from underrepresented communities." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. George stepped forward, joining Samuel at the podium. Together, they outlined their vision. A program that would combine Samuel's Olympic-level coaching expertise with George's community connections and understanding of the challenges faced by minority athletes. "We've secured funding from local businesses and sports organizations," George explained, gesturing to several prominent community leaders in the audience. "The program will operate year-round, offering not just swimming instruction, but mentorship and support." Samuel described how they'd already identified 3 locations for training facilities, including the private pool where Selena had trained during her ordeal. The owner had generously offered permanent access for the program's participants. "Every child deserves the chance to pursue their passion without fear or discrimination," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "What happened to Selena opened my eyes to how many talented young athletes might be held back by circumstances beyond their control." The initiative would start with 20 students, with plans to expand as resources allowed. They'd already received dozens of applications, each telling a unique story of determination in the face of adversity. George shared how local swimming clubs had pledged their support, offering equipment and volunteer assistance. Community members had stepped forward to help with transportation, ensuring that lack of access wouldn't prevent any child from participating. "This isn't just about creating champions in the pool," Samuel emphasized, looking at Selena. It's about building confidence, fostering resilience, and showing these kids that their dreams matter. The program would include regular workshops on dealing with discrimination, building mental toughness, and navigating the competitive sports world. Samuel and George had recruited other coaches and athletes to serve as guest speakers and mentors. When I retired, Samuel admitted, I thought my coaching days were over. But working with Selena reminded me why I fell in love with coaching in the first place. It's about more than just technique and training. It's about changing lives. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of a plaque honoring Samuel's dedication to youth athletics and social justice. As he accepted it, he called Selena to join him, acknowledging her role in inspiring this new chapter in his life. 10 years after her historic victory, Selena Brown stood before the gleaming glass doors of the newly constructed Brown Community Athletic Center. The morning sun reflected off the building's modern facade, highlighting the center's motto etched in bold letters: Dreams have no limits. Inside, the Olympic-sized swimming pool sparkled under state-of-the-art lighting. The water's surface rippled gently, a sight that still brought a smile to Selena's face, despite her years of competitive swimming and numerous medals. "This is exactly how I imagined it," she whispered to herself, running her hand along the smooth tile wall. The journey to this moment had been remarkable. After her initial triumph over Officer Niles' discrimination, Selena had gone on to break multiple national records. Her swimming career had taken her to competitions worldwide, where she'd earned gold medals and set new standards in the sport. But it was her work outside the pool that truly defined her legacy. The Selena Brown Foundation, established 5 years ago, had already provided scholarships and support to over 300 young athletes facing similar barriers she had encountered. Each success story added another layer of meaning to her own struggle. Now standing in her hometown once again, Selena watched as Coach Samuel, his hair now completely white but his spirit undimmed, conducted a training session with a diverse group of young swimmers. The old abandoned pool, where they had once trained in secret, seemed like a distant memory compared to this modern facility. "Miss Brown?" A young black girl, no more than 12, approached her timidly. "I read about your story in school. They said you never gave up, even when people tried to stop you." Selena knelt down to meet the girl's eyes. "That's right. And you know what? This pool, this whole center, it exists because of that story. Because sometimes the best way to fight back is to create something beautiful." The center had become more than just a swimming facility. It housed counseling services, educational support programs, and mentorship opportunities. The foundation ensured that no child would be turned away due to financial constraints. George and Lydia Brown, now proud grandparents, volunteered regularly at the center. George often shared their family's story with new members, while Lydia coordinated the parent support network she had wished existed during their own difficult times. Every wall displayed photographs of young athletes who had found their strength within these walls. Among them hung a particular image: Selena's first competition victory, the one that had started it all. Beside it, a simple plaque read, "Every wave begins with a single ripple." The center had become a symbol of transformation in the community. Former skeptics now sent their children here to train, and families drove from neighboring states to participate in its programs. What had started as one girl's dream to swim had evolved into a movement that touched countless lives. As Selena watched another group of young swimmers take their positions at the starting blocks, she saw in their faces the same determination she had felt all those years ago. But unlike her experience, these children would never have to train in secret or face their battles alone. The Brown Community Athletic Center stood as a testament to perseverance, a beacon of hope for anyone who dared to dream despite the odds. And for Selena, it represented the full circle of her journey. From a young girl fighting for her right to swim, to a champion ensuring that right for generations to come. If you enjoyed the story of Selena, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.